Hello, it's time for another video, another chapter. I'm reading all of my books, starting with Dad's Old Truck. I've I'm new to YouTube, and I wanted to make sure I got my stories out there. They're for sale through this web page listed up here over my head, and that web page will take you to Amazon, where the books are listed, so you can order them directly from Amazon. If you have Amazon Prime, you will receive free shipping on these books. Uh, I have 14 books, but I'm going to read every one of my books, one chapter at a time, starting with Dad's Old Truck, one, and then two, and work my way all the way through everything I've written. And so I hope you're having a good day today. Share this with your children. I have never written anything I wouldn't tell my young grandchildren. So, uh, but they're enjoyable for an adult as well. Bring back memories to your heart and your mind. The title of this book, well, first of all, is chapter 6. The title of this book is The Long Trip, and it looks at the way a young mind sees things. These were childhood memories from the 1950s. The trip is from Muskogee to Stillwell, Oklahoma. It's probably 100, 130 miles, 150. It's not very far in today's standards. And it starts off by the time Dad had a 57 Ford, and it was a brand new pickup. Uh, and it was a pretty mint green color. It was a nice pickup. We loved to ride in the back and let the wind blow across our faces. It was cooler than riding in an old hot car. If it were not raining, we would beg to ride in the truck, and would get in this trip we would get to ride in the truck. In 19 in the 1950s, the roads were not like they are today. The highway was usually a two-lane affair, meeting oncoming traffic as you drive, one going one direction and the other going the opposite direction. And if you're traveling at 55 miles an hour, when you pass each other, you're going 110 miles fast between the two. This caused the cars to come facing each other at highway speeds of 55 miles an hour uh, at that time for the day travel in Oklahoma, and 45 miles an hour for nighttime travel. If you were pulling a trailer, you traveled at night speed, day or night. These discrepancies in the speed of different vehicles caused a lot of frustration on the road. Get behind someone going 45 and you want to go 55, and there may not be places to turn or pass. The speed was also just right for the sounds that the concrete roads could make, a bumpety bump for every piece of concrete we passed. Some of you may recall that sound. We'll talk about it a little later. A trip back then was an undertaking that was looked at differently than it is today. From Muskogee to Stillwell is only about 75 miles, I say here. We traveled at almost that speed, more today than you might think. In the 50s, the roads were not as safe, and the comfort of travel was just a step above the Model A of yesterday. From Muskogee to Stillwell is not far by today's standards, but To a kid, it was a far piece to travel. We would take Highway 64 to the junction with Highway 62 to go across the Arkansas River and follow it to the next little town called Fort Gibson. Fort Gibson was a small town with a U.S. territory fort built in the times before Oklahoma became a state. The fort still stands today if you are interested in such things. The fort was built near the Neosho River that dumps into the Arkansas, where Highway 62 crosses the Arkansas River. Highway 62 then travels through Tahlequah, which is about 30 miles further down the road. We usually turned before we entered the town of Tahlequah. The hills began just before you got to Tahlequah, about 5 miles outside of town. We turned into Highway 82 and we would go south for about 15 miles. On this leg of the journey, we crossed a very tall bridge that spanned a narrow place on Lake Tenkiller. This is where the Illinois River becomes part of the lake. There was a public park nestled in the lovely hills there just before you crossed the bridge. We often stopped to have a sandwich on the way at this very spot. When we crossed the bridge, we would turn onto Highway 100 and would go another 20 miles or so to Stillwell, Oklahoma. This was an interesting drive because there was a swinging bridge that people had to cross by foot to get over a little creek and sometimes became a very big river when the heavy rains came. This was where some of my cousins lived and had to use the cable bridge to walk home on those days. By this time in our travel, we were in some big hills, perhaps 800 feet from base to top. Where we were going, the hill was 1,000 foot tall, and Aunt Helen lived right on top of that hill, just a little outside of Stillwell, Oklahoma. Stillwell was where they lived, but we were still 17 miles from their house. As I remember, we had to go to Arkansas to get to their house. The whole country was a little backward then, with the best roads paved in concrete and some with blacktop, but all were just 2 lanes. The road sound, Highway 62 was a concrete road, but with those concrete roads, there were expansion joints between each slab of concrete. At the expansion joint, they would lay some kind of tar to keep water from getting in between the slabs. As the road would heat up and expand, it would force some of the tar to collect at the surface and create a small bump. It did not cause the car to bump, but it could be heard and felt by the passengers in the car. This bump sounded like a rhythm that was a little hypnotic to we kids, and the small bumps seemed to put us into a daze. I still think about those rhythms of the highway from time to time as we travel today. Roads, the roads didn't have the same feel and the same rhythms are gone. And so are those hypnotic effects that kept mom and dad's kids quiet on a long trip. My wife Stephanie and I had to deal with my wife Stephanie and I had to deal with, are we there yet? For almost every trip we ever took, but still the roads are less tiring to the grown-ups today. The roads seem less boring to a kid when we got into the hills because of all the curves and the new sights that entered our view with every corner. The freeways today don't change like that. That part of Oklahoma was considered free range at that time. This meant that pigs and goats and cattle would be on the highway around any corner, and they often were. This added to the time it took to make the trip and added a measure of danger to the trip as well. We had heard of people being injured by running into animals on the road. The speed limit was 55 miles an hour, and people then, as they do now, went a little faster. I remember Dad having to slam on the brakes to avoid a very big pig on that trip. When we got to just outside Tahlequah, Dad would get us a bottle of pop. My favorite was grape knee high. I don't know if any of you remember that. We would nurse that pop all the way to Aunt Helen's house. We always looked for that little roadside service station that had one pump outside in front and an old man and an old woman that ran it. One of them, usually the old man, would talk to us kids and give us each a penny piece of gum. Then say he'd see us on the next trip we took. We would have most of the pop left when we got to the park at the Lake Tenkiller and had a sandwich. The trip was an adventure in the middle of a long hot summer, and it wasn't always cool or cooler at Aunt Helen's house on top of the mountain. When we arrived, we would all hug each other and say our hellos to Aunt Helen and Uncle John. Then we kids would slip off and find whatever mischief we could find. Uncle John had a farm and he raised some vegetables that he sold to the Stillwell Canning Company. Dad had come to help haul the stuff to the cannery because Uncle John's truck had quit for some reason. All I cared about was that we got to come over to their house and the little pond that we loved to swim in. The trip was over, and now we could get down to business of playing. The best play happened at the pond. They had a little pond that was about 150 yards from the house, and as soon as we could, we would slip off and jump into that pond. I think we tell, let me see, I think, oh, I went 2 pages, spent more time than half of the day, the first day at that pond. When I took back, when I look back in retrospect, the pond was muddy and quite small. It may have only held 3 foot of water at the deep part, and the banks were of clay and they were slick and hard to stand on. The pond itself was not much bigger than a front yard, maybe 50 foot by 100 foot. The pond was just deep enough to go underwater to scare someone. It was in the woods, and before we got into the pond, Joe and I would say we had seen a snake over there somewhere. There was no snake, but it added to the fear for the girls. We would we could make the girls scream like little girls. When you got tired of swimming or scratching, I'm sorry, or scaring the girls, you could catch crawdads around the edge of that bank. They like to build in old cow tracks too. The pond was a stock pond and was not very clean. I would not swim in it nowadays. When we first arrived at the pond, it would be a chalky blue or gray color, but within 10 minutes, it was as brown as the clay that it sat in. I think we were dirtier when we got out of the pond than when we got into the pond. That didn't matter. It was water we could splash around in, and it was a good way to keep cool. There were trees all around the pond, and the elevation of the pond was lower than the house, and you could see the pond very well from the house. Joe and I took great advantage of the fact that you could not see the house. Well, I'm sorry, you could not see the pond from the house. And Joe and I took great advantage of the fact that you could not see the house from the pond. It gave us privacy so that we could smoke a cigarette. Now we did not have a pack of cigarettes, but a pouch of Bull Durham. Joe had taken from his grandpa, Uncle Jim, that was Uncle John's father and my dad's uncle. They lived on top of the same mountain about 2 miles from Uncle John's house. Joe kept the pouch hidden in an old tree knothole that was on the bank of that old pond. Joe and I were sitting just over the dam of the pond where the girls could not see us either. You see, they would tell on us if they knew or make us share with them, depending on who had seen us. Here we were, safe from the house and safe from the other kids, and Joe went and retrieved the tobacco from the knothole, and he had some rolling papers too. I watched as Joe rolled his cigarette with such ease. He must have done this many times to be so good at it. He held the piece of paper that was so thin that I think you could have been able to read through it. The paper was held between his middle finger and his pointer finger, right there between the two. And held between, let's see, the paper was held between his middle finger and the pointer finger, and the ring finger that could hold the tobacco. Joe then took the pouch and bit one side of and pulled on the other side, causing the pouch to open. Still holding the cigarette paper in his other hand, he began to pour the tobacco into the valley the paper had formed. Then when Joe had enough tobacco in the trough, he then took the pouch and bit one side and pulled the string that was attached to the top of the pouch, closing it very nicely. Now that he had the tobacco in the paper, he handed the pouch to me. I watched as he took the other hand to assist in the rolling up the cigarette. into what looked like what people today think of as a doobie. He took his tongue and made the paper wet with saliva and then rolled it up. The cigarette was twisted at both ends to hold the tobacco in place, and it was ready to light. Joe told me to go ahead and roll mine. I wasted almost half of his tobacco after 4 attempts. I realized that I would never be able to roll a cigarette. That's when Joe took the makings and rolled me one. We sat there looking up at the bright blue August sky, and knew that we were on top of the world. Neither one of us inhaled the smoke, but we looked cool in the doing. Pardon me. It was something we knew we should not do, and that was the attraction of it. We would go do it anyway. I hope you enjoyed this story. The next chapter will be chapter 7, Whip Poor Will, and it happened on this same trip. And I think you'll enjoy that. And it's a wonderful day outside. I hope you have a wonderful day where you're at. God bless you. And until next time, if you like what you hear here, share it with your children, share it with your friends, subscribe, like, and share. Thank you.